With Midnight fast approaching and beta testing well underway, I wanted to break down what's happening with each of the Paladin specs after their reworks going into the next expansion. This will focus more on gameplay mechanics and how each spec will function more broadly, not so much from an output or tuning perspective. I've previously said that tier lists are mostly slop content that don't apply to 99% of the player base, and tier lists at this point in time for Midnight are particularly absurd. I'll also only focus on the most important changes rather than reading every single change verbatim just to keep things condensed. Thought I'd also get into the Christmas spirit. Merry Christmas, everyone. I've timestamped the video, so if you are only interested in a particular spec, feel free to skip towards that section. I'll provide links to any of the change logs for anyone who's interested in reading more in depth as well. As for why I'm worth listening to, I've mained Retribution Paladin for years, obtaining both Cutting Edge and the 0.1% Mythic Plus title, and right now I'm actively pushing on all three Paladin specs towards the 0.1% title. So I have a pretty solid feel for how each of these specs plays, specifically in high-end dungeon content. We'll start out with Retribution Paladin. Now, compared to the other Paladin specs, as well as a lot of the other classes for that matter, Ret has seen much less of an overhaul in its design. I think this is mainly due to the fact that Ret Paladin was arguably the first spec that was reworked with accessibility and approachability in mind. So the changes done in Dragonflight are already in line with the philosophy that Blizzard is driving towards. There are two core themes with Ret Paladin's changes. Firstly, the removal of abilities and talents which cause passive holy power generation. As it stands, Ret players need to track things like melee swing timers and the Divine Resonance buff that comes on after you use Divine Toll in order to know exactly when their holy power is being generated. This is fairly clunky and it does rely pretty heavily on weak auras. So to address this, Blizzard have removed Crusading Strikes. So this has reintroduced Templar Strikes as an active button that we need to press again. Historically, Templar Strikes has also felt very clunky to press because it sort of gives us one too many generating buttons for our holy power. However, alongside this change, they're also removing Hammer of Wrath and baking it into Judgment during Wings, effectively making it a single button. So I think ultimately the Templar Strikes change will probably feel quite good now that Hammer of Wrath is no longer a button on its own. Divine Toll has also been changed. Instead of firing off judgments randomly every 5 seconds after using the ability, it's now changed to cause your next 3 judgments after to cast twice. This is very similar to the ability Bastion of Light that Prot Paladin has at the moment. Instead of making a buff pop up that throws out judgments, it just buffs your next judgments that you use. There are a few extra talent changes that are targeted towards random holy power generation, like Boundless Judgment, no longer making judgment generate additional holy power. However, the Divine Toll and Crusading Strikes changes are probably the biggest shifts at this point. The second focal point of the changes is the one that I'm probably the most excited about personally. It's removing the hard distinction between AoE and single target builds. As it stands, Ret has always had a problem with needing to pick between one or the other, which has left us in some sort of awkward situations in dungeons with smaller pools or more focuses on mini-boss and lieutenant mobs. The main changes here include removal of our typical capstone AoE and single target talents, which were Divine Arbiter and Searing Light, merging of Final Reckoning and Execution Sentence. Now, this is actually a sick change. I love this. It basically means that in cooldowns, Ret will naturally have more priority damage, which is great because it's something that we don't ordinarily have. However, the change also maintains the semi-uncapped AoE that we sort of know and love at this point as well. There has also been an overall shift in the damage profile towards the spenders. While tuning is still to come, the main theme of the numbers at the moment is to reduce the damage of Blade of Justice and Judgment and increase the damage of Final Verdict and Divine Storm. What I think is good about this is it's not only a focus on the talents as to whether we pick single target or AoE, it's more blended together, but you can also choose in the moment by what ability you pick to spend your holy power on. So this is very, very similar to how like current Frost DK is working. Lastly, the more gameplay focused changes, Radiant Glory has been significantly nerfed. So this is the ability that makes Wake of Ashes proc our wings, and it is now bringing Ret back more into the classic like 1 minute cooldown spec, with wings being a button that we need to press. This will also line up nicely with the combined execution sentence final reckoning ability. The hero talents remain fairly similar. The main focus here, I think, is that Divine Hammers has been moved into the Templar tree and basically just activates for 8 seconds after we use Divine Toll. My only concern here with the talent trees, specifically the hero talents, is it appears that Herald is still significantly more AoE focused and Templar is much more single target focused, which does somewhat go against the philosophy that they're driving towards of not having distinct specs that we need to pick between. Ret's Apex talents are also pretty basic. They pretty much just buff the damage of our core abilities and don't really change the playstyle all that much. Overall, I think the changes are fairly positive. It seems that Ret will play very similarly to how it did in sort of mid to late Dragonflight, which I think is an awesome playstyle. It was great back then. My main concern for high-end Mythic Plus is that Ret will still have a very paddy DPS style, while the execution sentence and final reckoning combination does give us a little more priority damage. Naturally, the vast majority of our DPS is still going to come from our semi-uncapped AoE from Divine Storm. The issue here is that unless Retribution is like significantly overtuned from an output point of view, sort of like Unholy DK was in Season 2, it is unlikely to see a lot of play in high-end Mythic Plus, because priority and funnel damage are normally a lot more valuable than mass AoE, unless the mass AoE is like ridiculously good. However, outside of this like really top-end niche stuff, I expect Ret to fit a very similar role that it does at the moment, being a really solid pick for any keys that are below a title range key and still have a fairly consistent flat damage profile. However, it will be a touch more spiky now that we move back towards the 1 minute cooldown. Next up, we'll look at Protection Paladin. At the moment, entering combat as Protection Paladin feels miserable. We basically always need to be spamming Blessed Hammer to generate some holy power. We often need to pre-defensive as we're going into packs, and this is mainly just because Prot Paladin is at a massive risk of dying if it doesn't have Shield of the Righteous or some sort of active mitigation up as soon as the pack is pulled. Now though, the change that they are making is the addition of a passive called Valiant Crusade, which means that when we use Divine Steed out of combat, so basically when we're running into a pack, it will give us Shield of the Righteous for its entire duration plus 2 seconds after our horse goes away. This gives a lot more breathing room in establishing a pool, because we don't have to be frantically trying to get Shield of the Righteous up and running while also trying to gather threat on everything around us. Consecration's also been changed so that we don't need to be standing in it permanently. It still has a minor defensive buff through the talent Sanctuary, which gives a 5% damage reduction, but it's not like something that we need to be in 100% of the time, and it should allow for Prot Paladins to move around a lot more freely. One of the bigger changes as well is that Prot Paladin's Mastery has been sort of entirely reworked. Mastery now is going to give us a block chance that is equal to our Mastery percentage and double that for spells. So if you have 20% Mastery, this will equate to 20% physical block and 40% spell block. Now, on paper, the idea that Blizzard has is to make Paladins much more tanky passively, since at the moment, it's very reliant on cooldowns, and you almost need to just be sort of randomly rotating between cooldowns, even just in the middle of a not super dangerous part of a pack, otherwise you do just risk falling over. The problem here is I don't know if this change actually achieves that goal at all. As it currently stands, a large portion of our rotation involves weaving in Avenger's Shield and Word of Glory, which activate the buffs Barricade of Faith and Faith in the Light. On screen here, you can see this little tracker down in the corner. Now, This is very annoying at the moment because Prot Paladin's gameplay is basically trying to maintain 3 invisible buffs by casting sort of abilities that we don't necessarily always want to be casting. It doesn't really feel that nice to play. However, these buffs do give us 100% spell block at a certain mastery threshold, which is actually fairly low. With these buffs taken away, the spec legitimately feels less tanky even with this mastery change. The other thing too is that tanks that rely on a percentage chance to mitigate damage are basically never going to be good. The thing is that with tanking, you need to use abilities at particular times to guarantee that you will live something. If you're running in and you have a percentage spell block or a percentage block chance, you basically always run the risk of low rolling and just dying because you don't proc that percentage chance. This sort of gambly playstyle is really not good, and I hope that we see some fairly significant changes going forward as well. Now, these changes are also done alongside the removal of our wings cooldown reduction and Eye of Tyr as a defensive. However, we've been compensated by Blessing of Kings also having 2 charges. Overall, they seem to be wanting to make Prot Paladin a lot more one-dimensional, but as it stands, it looks like they've been given consistency in gameplay at the expense of their survivability. So unless it is tuned ridiculously, in which case it would probably be borderline unkillable, I can't see Protection Paladin being able to survive any serious level content in its current state. Looking at the most recent changes as well, it appears that they've had to do some pretty drastic things to try and drag it back in line. They've basically halved the CD of Kings, increased Word of Glory healing by 100%, and buffed a bunch of passive healing. This looks like they're sort of scrambling to make this spec playable. It may pan out okay, but as it currently stands, it looks like Protection Paladin is going to be ultra squishy. Overall though, I think the changes are largely positive from a gameplay loop perspective. As I said before, trying to maintain 3 passive buffs on top of juggling like multiple different defensives and needing to stand in consecration all the time is made for a not overly fun tank to play. However, I think that in its current state, while it might be more fun to play, if you're dying, it's not going to be fun to play. From a gameplay perspective, just looking at like beta footage as well, the damage is insane. So it looks as if Prot Paladin is going to fit that niche of extremely high damage glass cannon tank, which would probably be very fun at like a weekly key level. However, any sort of serious level of content, it feels like Protection Paladin is going to be extremely hard to play. We're going to have to watch the tuning. I feel like of the 3, Prot Paladin is probably the one that's going to be receiving the most changes going forward, and you can even see this reflected in the sort of high numbers that they've used to tune everything at the moment. Last up, we'll have a look at Holy Paladin. Now, Holy is probably the spec that has received the biggest overhaul of all of the 3. The overarching goal is basically to make Holy Paladin less reliant on a mountain of like unclear passive buffs and passive healing sources. They also want to make Aura Mastery a button which feels good to press, because at the moment, AM feels borderline useless. Like, I often prefer to press the Lumathar trinket if it's available over Aura Mastery, which is really bad given that it's like the longest cooldown that we've got. Light of Dawn is also getting a massive quality of life change, and it's now been turned into a 40-yard radius all the way around us instead of the awkward frontal cone that it currently is. So the core changes to note for Holy Pally: Crusader Strikes has been removed, with more emphasis placed on Holy Shock. With this, HPAL is very much being pushed in the direction of being a mid-ranged caster healer rather than a full-blown melee healer. Holy Prism and Divine Toll are now sharing a choice node, which is interesting because I feel like at present Divine Toll is by far the strongest button of the 2, so you'd basically always want to pick that. However, I'd probably miss Holy Prism in the current M+ build. This may not matter as much though, because this is mainly with the Beacon of Virtue build that Holy Pally is playing at the moment in mind. So it might not be as impactful if different beacons become the focal point in the next patch. Similar to Ret Pally's, Hammer of Wrath is now being baked into Judgment during Wings. This effectively makes it the same button. This is great, I think, because Hammer of Wrath has been a really bloaty button on HPL, and you pretty much rarely press it in dungeons, so it's nice to just have it removed and put into another ability. As I mentioned above, the idea behind making Aura Mastery a decent button to press, to achieve this, they have basically just made it so that Divine Toll casts when you press AM with a passive called Ringing of the Heavens. This does feel kind of weird because it doesn't sort of like straight up buff Aura Mastery. It's just kind of like giving you a free Divine Toll, but I guess like strictly speaking, it is a buff, so it is a positive change, I suppose. With Crusader Strike being removed, they've also baked in some cooldown reduction into Holy Shock. This means that the core rotation for Holy Pally is going to be very heavily reliant on Holy Shock, but it will also prevent a gap from being left due to the absence of Crusader Strike. So it looks like the cadence is going to be Holy Shock, Judgment, Holy Shock, and then spending on our normal spenders. They've removed a handful of talents as well: Barrier of Faith, Blessing of Seasons, Boundless Salvation, Merciful Auras, and Relentless Inquisitor, alongside of a bunch of redesigned talents. I won't go over everything in depth, but again, this is focusing on removing a bunch of random sort of middling abilities that basically just bloated the spec as a whole. I will say though, I am sad to see Blessing of Seasons go because I do quite like that button. In terms of playstyle, it's actually going to be very similar to how it is at present, but just minus the excessive amount of buttons. The core of the spec is looking like it's going to weave back and forth between Holy Shock and Judgment to build Holy Power, and then Word of Glory / Eternal Flame being the main spender in dungeons, and Light of Dawn being the main button for AoE healing in Raid. It's a little unclear as to whether Light of Dawn will translate overly well into Mythic Plus. Typically, it hasn't scaled all that well into 5-man content, but we'll see when the tuning comes in, I guess. Holy is also getting a fairly interesting Apex talent in Beacon of Savior. This is a passive beacon that is going to go to the lowest health ally and function like the other beacons as well, so transferring healing. It will also constantly jump to new players, providing like additional healing and a decent shield that reduces damage being taken. This is really cool, honestly. It sounds almost like that auto sack talent that we have at the moment that no one ever really plays, but even better than that. Really cool change. Also fits the vibe of the spec as well. Not too much to be said for the hero talents. They do function fairly similar to how they do now, mostly just being sort of hands-off buffs that are tied to the abilities that we're already using. So probably just going to be a case of picking whichever one has the best throughput. Overall, I think the changes are actually really positive for Holy Pally. Despite the bloat, it actually feels really good at the moment, like in the current retail. So the fact that the spec is retaining a lot of its identity and then tidying up a lot of the pain points from the bloat and making certain abilities like Aura Mastery and Light of Dawn actually feel good to press makes me think that if Holy Pally is tuned well, it's going to be an awesome pick going into Midnight, because it is quite fun at the moment, even with the pain points that it's got. So yeah, that's basically where all three of the Paladin specs are sitting going into Midnight, at least purely from a gameplay and design perspective. Ret looks like it's getting a nice little quality of life pass, nothing being really reinvented, but just smoothing out a lot of the sort of janky holy power generation and the distinction between the AoE and single target builds. Prot is, I think, moving in the right direction. However, it probably needs a fairly significant pass at the moment because it's just lost heaps of its tankiness, even though it has lost some of those really clunky abilities that I was talking about earlier. And Holy is probably the one that I'm the most excited about. Holy is really cool right now, and it looks like they're just making it even cooler going into Midnight. The big disclaimer here is this is the beta. A lot of this is still going to change, and realistically, even if something like Holy Pally that isn't looking great from a gameplay perspective, if it's overtuned numbers-wise, it'll still be good, right? So this is purely from like a design philosophy point of view, rather than a what you should pick. If anyone tells you what specs you should be picking right now, it is just nonsense. We need to wait and see. Thank you for everyone who made it all the way till the end. Special thank you to my YouTube members, Mr. Ghost Splinter, and everyone else listed on screen. If you want to support, click the join button below the video. Otherwise, Merry Christmas. Until next time, gamers, take care.